With an inter-stadium battle on tap to close out the preseason slate, the New York Football Giants have questions at tight end. They have questions at inside linebacker. Frankly, they have questions across the roster. We dive in on the impact for this team, some names that maybe could get brought in, and just a general sense of where this roster and this new coaching staff are in developing continuity and chemistry going forward. Yes, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht breaking down the Brooklyn Nets, baby. We just got superstars back. It's like we just signed new stars to the Brooklyn Nets. Over there, you're going to find the healthy, wealthy, and wise, the seasoned generational ticket holder, Mr. Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir?
I am good. I have a favor to ask you, Adam,
Yep.
right off the top of the show. Do you have at least 25 grand sitting around that I could borrow?
So we did. We said top of the show, pre-show. I said, hey, I got something to surprise you with, little nugget. And he said, I had a little surprise myself. I think it'll be the same thing. And indeed it is. I wouldn't hate it, man. I feel like in a lot of ways over the past 3 years, I've earned a championship ring from the New York Football Giants, and now's my opportunity to do so.
Well, think about it, Adam. So for anyone that doesn't know, and I still don't know if this is like a positive or a sad thing. Like whenever you see former athletes selling their rings, it always brings up a question. But Super Bowl champion Akeem Nicks selling his Super Bowl ring from the 2011 season. They're listing it at auction for 25 grand. Most people say that these rings go for anywhere from 75 grand, 80 grand and up. But Adam, I mean, why don't you just take a small sliver of all the profits you've made from One Giant Podcast and just buy the ring outright? It'd be great for the show. It'd be great to have that swag on camera. I think it's an investment well made on your part.
Labeling Andy as an unpaid intern is really gonna come back to provide an opportunity here for yours truly. I think it's a smart play. To your point, I don't know. It didn't say anything. I caught this one article. They were talking with him. He was on the podcast with I think it's for Giants.com. This is going back. This is 2020. So they gave a little quote about the turning point of the Super Bowl season and all that good stuff. It doesn't indicate anything as far as what is, inspiring him to do this, other than to say it could go expectations around upwards of $80,000. So again, I'm in it at 25. I'm feeling still pretty frisky at 35, but anything over 40, and I think it's just foolhardy at that point.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, the last note on this is he did mention somewhere that some of the proceeds of selling this ring is going to go to charity. Now, whether or not it's $5 or $50,000 will remain to be seen. But yes, it's always good. Great to hear a familiar name and a familiar face in Akeem Nicks being back in the spotlight. And it also just reminded me about that 2011 championship. Giants defeating the Patriots 21-17. Got the good vibes flowing all over again.
Could be a lot of different things. Hopefully some of those go to charity. It does remind me of that classic Redman Method Man film, How High I Need Money. And listen, other people that might need money could be some free agents potentially for the New York Football Giants, because they are going to have some roster spots to fill. Obviously, we said at the top there, we know the tight end position, the inside linebacker position with Darian Beavers going down. We also have Ricky Seals-Jones hitting the IR with that funny little toe of his that can't quite seem to get sorted out. And the Giants also cut themselves down to an 80-man roster. Who'd they go ahead and jettison along with those moves, because it finagles where the number stands?
Yeah, so the Giants had to get down to the 80-man roster by 4 p.m. On Tuesday afternoon. So you mentioned a couple of names, but I'll just run through them just so you have the whole collection list. Darian Beavers with his torn ACL goes to IR. Tight end Ricky Seals-Jones with his mysterious toe injury goes to IR. And Andre Miller with his broken forearm goes to IR as well. To clean things up, to get on the PUP list, they put Nick Gates and Matt Pert. And what that reserve PUP list means is that neither of those two players is going to be available for the first 4 weeks. There's a whole thing to unpack here on a little bit of it. Did you have any initial reactions to those being the moves that the Giants made to get down to 80?
Well, on the Gates and the Pert piece, because speaking of someone you haven't heard or seen anything, a little bit of buzz early around training camp of Nick Gates getting into it. Now, I think for him, it feels a little bit different because the sample size was going in the positive direction. He's a nice depth piece. Pert is a mystery as far as what he looks like. I think a lot of guys got a bump underneath this new staff. So you'd like to think that if he could get out there, it could be good for him. The real problem is that the Giants need offensive linemen, because that says nothing about the Shane Lemieux issues and the 13 centers, right, and everything else that's going on there. So getting them to IR is fine, but it actually compounds the area of need that the Giants have right now, to say nothing of what we're going to focus on, tight end and inside linebacker. But offensive line is still like this little weird evolving scenario. It was good to see some positive reps from guys in preseason game number 2, especially ones who were taking a shot at positions they had never played.
So when I saw the moves that the Giants made to get down to 80, I thought of it in, I kind of removed myself from just the individual players and thought at a macro level what was going on, because if you think about Pert and Gates, they still count towards the 80-man roster, even though they're going on the PUP list.
Yeah, so holding those spots.
And so they're going to be holding those 80-man roster spots, not to mention all the players that are dinged up you mentioned before. Shane Lemieux, Zudu, like all the different players that have had
Feliciano's in that mix.
Feliciano, all of them that have injuries. The Giants are getting extremely thin. And so, there's a couple things that came to my mind when I saw this list. One, surprising that Nick Gates didn't go to season-ending IR. I expected him to have kind of a longer journey back to play for the Giants. By putting him on the PUP list, they're saying we still think he has a chance to play. It's obviously not going to be in the first 4 weeks anymore, but maybe mid-season they look at it as an addition or a depth piece, as long as he shows up that he's healthy and able to contribute. So I found that fascinating. The other piece of it, Adam, was an omission to the PUP list, and that was Sterling Shepard. I think that was a big question mark for the Giants of, will he be able to contribute early on, or is he going to end up on the PUP list? They're going to rest him for the first 4 games. Now there's talk like, is he going to be ready for week 1? Do they hold him out to week 2 or week 3? But either way, it seems like they're giving him every opportunity to be out there week 1 against the Titans.
Yeah, and we combine it with what we talked about in preseason game number 2. Now, again, we're not getting the full sample size of what this team is going to look like, what the offensive scheme is going to be. But Wan'Dale Robinson, you haven't seen him find his rhythm yet in the preseason. So obviously, and you mentioned too, Sterling Shepard can be a guy on the outside, obviously given some depth behind Kenny Golladay, behind Kadarius Toney. He's a versatile weapon. First of all, we all know what a fan I am of Sterling Shepard, and I wanted him to still be on this roster. I'm glad that it looks like he's going to be, at least at this point. But what a tragedy that the place where the Giants are getting bolstered with maybe more health is a spot where we're coming out of a game where we go, and David Sills looks pretty good, and Colin Johnson's been playing consistent, and Alec Boxman is on tear, and we know Richie James has already been putting good film on tape, right? So all the go. The spot where we feel pretty good about it, even if Kenny Golladay is struggling a little and we're waiting for Toney to get on the field healthy. Yeah, we also have an experienced veteran wide receiver who could go ahead and be in the mix there and could maybe ultimately end up costing another young player a spot on this roster. First time in my Giants life where I'm like, oh, what a weird spot we're in now, because Sterling Shepard might actually be ready. Your feedback here as well, but I do think this is also a great opportunity potentially, which would also hurt my heart, for Sterling Shepard to put some good film on tape and be on the trade market by the time the deadline comes.
Yeah, I mean, that's another option. I don't necessarily.
Oh, and goodbye, Darius Slayton would obviously be the other.
I mean, that was where I was going to go next. It was funny. Darius Slayton just started following Alex Bachman on Twitter, and they had this little back and forth, which I thought was pretty funny. Where Alex was like, I scored 2 touchdowns in a preseason game. I finally get a follow after 3 years from my teammate. And Darius Slayton's like, oh, you mean the guy that's trying to take my job? And it's like, ha ha, all love. And it's kind of like, well, actually, he is probably going to take your job, because he's got 80% of the production at a fraction of the price. But Adam, this 80-man roster thing, the way that I think about this is, with the Giants having so many people injured, it's also concerning what they're going to do ahead of the preseason finale against the Jets. They need enough players out there to be able to compete and figure out who has those final roster spots. It's getting so bad to the point is Graham Gano has a concussion right now. He is not going to participate likely in this Jets preseason finale. The Giants are so thin with roster positions. They're wondering if they just go the rest of the preseason game without picking up another kicker, because they need the roster spots in other areas, and go for 2 and be able to just have Jamie Gillen do the extra points, which, like, that's how thin it is right now for the Giants in terms of depth at other positions.
Oh, of course, man. Yeah, listen, and that's why I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, all teams do this. You're at 80, you're going to cut 27 guys to get to 53. But I think the Giants may do a very dramatic shuffle, because it's We need to carry enough random bodies to get through this last preseason game and then shuffle everything that we need to accomplish. And that could include other players that we're planning on bringing in, but there's no reason to bring them in before the third preseason game because we want the cut candidate to go out there and eat those reps for one more game. So it's going to be funny to see how this unfolds here. I may call hit me with any other thoughts you have here, because I may call a little bit of an audible just noticing that within the last 13 minutes of the start of our recording, we had a Giants Wire put out a new 53-man projection for the roster, which includes the injuries, kind of updating what this looks like. And there's maybe some conversation pieces inside of that.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to this, I don't want to overreact about the 80-man roster, but we talked about the injuries at the offensive line. When you have 6 or 7 guys that are expected to make the roster on the offensive line that are injured and not going to be participating, that means you need 6 or 7 more offensive linemen just to be able to have first team and second team reps in practice. Like, that's how deep this issue is with the Giants injuries right now. Yeah. And so, like, we talk about the 80-man roster, 27 of these guys are going to get cut. A lot of guys that are even going to be starting the third preseason game are unlikely to make this roster if some of these guys can come back healthy.
Yeah, so yes, I can only agree with you there. It's so weird to look at what is going to potentially happen here. And even though we may look at some guys on the offensive line and say, there's some short-term value over the course of the season, even it disrupts all your other decision-making processes, I think, potentially. And the worst part about that is the continuity piece, where who might the Giants miss out on because they have to carry the extra bodies on the line. Then all of a sudden you turn around and you get yourself into a scenario where another team grabs a tight end, grabs a linebacker, grabs a cornerback, and you can't afford to not carry the extra bodies to make sure you're going to be healthy going into the season. Before we do talk 50, yeah, go ahead.
Dan Duggan made one interesting point. We talked about Beavers going to IR. We talked about Ricky Seals-Jones going to IR and Andre Miller going with the broken forearm. What they can do with this quote-unquote season-ending IR is be able to actually negotiate an injury settlement with a guy like Miller or a guy like Seals-Jones, where you pay a fraction of the price. He gets out of the injury designation, and he could end up playing for the Giants this year or another team. So I wouldn't be surprised if Ricky Seals-Jones reaches an injury settlement and he potentially plays for the Giants after being in camp. The Giants have kept him around knowing that he's had this toe injury. So something tells me that maybe they're going to work something out, on the back end where he could still be a contributor on the roster.
Yeah, it does feel like, again, new regime, new coaching staff. You brought him in. You like the veteran presence. And if there's like a mutual understanding, whatever we have to do to kind of massage the roster to get where we need to be, you'll still end up back here when you're healthy, even if it's going to be 5 weeks, not 4 weeks, and you designate, et cetera, et cetera. Before we do, I hopped on for a live discussing the injuries for Thibodeau and for Beavers, but obviously it's just worth reiterating here that Kayvon Thibodeau dodges out of the 2 players. I said I prefer neither of them have the injuries, but Thibodeau looks like he's going to be on a much better track getting back, although you still do need to safeguard against how quickly you bring him back in, because it's 3 to 4 weeks, and that's right into the start of the season. It could be a couple of games before he makes his debut for Big Blue.
Yeah, so they obviously say 3 to 4 weeks, and it just so happens when that injury designation comes out, it's 20 days instead of 21 days from the opener, against the Titans. So it's like, wow, it's really interesting that lines up almost perfectly with week 1. And you know what? It looked like his knee got twisted a little bit, and he's actually getting a second opinion, I believe, from Dr. James Andrews. Very commonplace, just to make sure there is no structural damage. Can't hurt to do that when your body is your livelihood. So he's getting that checked out. To be honest with you, after seeing him joking around, walking around on the sidelines, like feeling pretty good, I actually would be surprised if he's not out there for week 1 against Tennessee. Obviously, I'm no doctor, don't know the severity of the injury, but it just feels like the Giants are basically saying, we're hoping that he's going to be out there for week 1. You're not going to see him out on the field unless it's Sunday against the Titans.
Oh yeah, good Lord,
like you're not going to see him he's going to be hanging out in street clothes for a while until we're ready to go.
Okay, let's pivot here, because there's some tight end names, but more guys are going to get cut. There's linebacker names, more guys are going to get cut. Jalen Smith jumped right back into my mind. He was, they brought him in last year, different coaching staff, whatever. There's other tight ends that are, there's veterans out there. Jerry Cook is still out there and exist. There's a lot of options that we have here. In some ways, we could spin around 13 different ideas. And then once they sign someone, we'll get a little bit of clarity about how important they think that is. When I hopped over on Giants Wire, though, and we looked at this depth chart, or this 53-man roster projection, excuse me, for where we think potentially the Giants could go, there's a couple of things that jumped out here. For starters, the QB spot, don't worry about. They're going to carry 3. That makes all the sense in the world. We know Davis Webb is pushing for the number 1 spot. Running back wise, Barkley, Breida, and Williams. I take no issue with Antonio Williams being, obviously he's earned it, right? Brightwell now with a little bit of the injury concerns, I guess is a part of that factor as well. Does this make sense to you? I guess, I mean, Matt Breida is also dealing with the injury issues. We think, or we've, speculated, maybe they're just like sneakily not having him potentially get injured. And then you get Corbin to the practice squad, and maybe Brightwell just falls by the wayside because of the timing of his injury. But man, this preseason, we talked about it before. It changed my mind on Brightwell in a big way. Like so many players underneath this, a good coaching staff turns out makes players a lot better.
So this feels like the safest bet, just knowing that they signed Matt Breida in the offseason. But remember, Adam, he only has $150,000 guaranteed in his contract. So it's not a huge number. Like if you were to release Matt Breida and move on from Darius Slayton, you're freeing up over $2 million on the roster. So there's checks and balances here. What I will say is it's going to be interesting to see if they put Breida on the PUP list. Like we don't really know what he's hurt with. We don't fully understand what's going on. But putting him on the PUP list would allow you to either keep Brightwell from going somewhere else, keep Jayshon Corbin if you believe that he's got the upside. But to me, it actually feels,
and then shuffle someone down to the practice squad in season once it clears up. Which I would love, right?
Exactly. And so the way that I'm looking at it, though, is I think Antonio Williams is a much safer bet to make the roster than Matt Breida is right now. I would almost move Antonio Williams up to number 2 right now because he's doing everything. There's literally nothing else that Antonio Williams could have done in this camp to put himself in a better position for this roster. He's catching passes out of the backfield, 5 to 7 balls a game. He's running the ball at almost 5 yards a clip. Like he is doing everything that you want a guy to do. So for me, he's far safer than Matt Breida, who knows like when he's going to come back or what the situation is.
100%. In the wide receiver room, just quickly, CJ Board obviously had that rib injury. I like what they did here. We talked about Sterling Shepard being close to coming back potentially. Galladay, Shepard, Tony, Johnson, Robinson, Sills, and Bachman. Like, I like this, and that obviously would be the speculation that at some point, whether trade or cut, Darius Slayton is not going to be a part of this unit going forward. Like, I just like, we've said this a lot on the podcast, if you're going to follow the Brian Daboll, approach of show it in the film room, show it on the practice field, show it on Sunday, get more reps. Well, then you've got guys in this room that have shown that. Now you're hedging your bets around the fact that Kenny Galladay makes a ton of money and Sterling Shepard is a veteran. But I like that the other 3 ones, Colin Johnson has obviously earned a roster spot, but even Sills and Bachman, they've been around. We've always heard about Sills and Daniel Jones and their connection. Like, go with the guys that have shown you a little spark, right? Like, don't lean too heavy, even though I know you need it, on that special teams value piece, because CJ Board has never flashed the way these other guys have in preseason or the regular season.
You know what's crazy, Adam? The craziest part of this list that came out on Giants Wire is they list the 7 wide receivers, and in the comments below it, they're like, we spent a lot of time debating between Richie James and CJ Board, who's now a little bit injured, but this is why we made the decision. You're like, where's Darius Slayton? Like, you didn't even mention Darius Slayton. He has fallen so far down.
I give the presumptive information, but it's like, like you didn't say we assume he's traded, or let's just safely bet the money matters and they cut him 100%. Yeah, they definitely blew past that. Do you have any issue that? And then also, though, like Richie James, do you think that he's more deserving of it than, say, Alex Bachman? Because Bachman is 26 years old. Like, he's not a 24-year-old Colin Johnson.
I'm curious to know who's going to be doing punt returns and kick returns. I had the idea in my mind that Richie James was the guy, but if they go by committee or Kadarius Toney does it, or whomever of these different wide receivers.
Worth noting that Corbin has done some of that too, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. He's another guy that has that open field electric ability if he gets the ball in his hands. I don't know, 7 wide receivers. I guess if you feel like one of these guys is going to get claimed, that's fine. I probably would rather have an extra body at the tight end position or linebacking position. Don't really have too many issues with it. I thought either Sills and Bachman were fighting for the last spot themselves. He includes both of them. They're both playing well. I'm happy that they're both, able to make the roster in that case.
Bellinger, Akins, and Merrick are going to be the guys they have for the tight end position. This is one that, again, we're not even going to talk about because something's going to happen here. Something's going to look different. Bellinger's the only thing that you can guarantee. I guess Akins being the other veteran in there makes sense. But I mean, I'm mentioning it to mention it. I want to get to the offensive line, but it's a blow by for me because there's so much uncertainty what's going to happen here.
I just have one
Yeah.
thing on the tight end position, nothing to do with who's going to be there. Presumably, there's obviously going to be roster claims at some point. But do you feel like maybe we haven't really fully seen what Daniel Bellinger is? I know I'm very high on him, but because the competition has been less than veteran leaders who have had success in the NFL or young rookies that had high draft picks, like Daniel Bellinger is competing against journeymen and guys that have been on the practice squad. Does that kind of elevate how we're perceiving him as a tight end number one? Like if you had real competition, would he look differently than it does right now?
Yeah, maybe. But I think is what I think about more is because of the injury with Ricky Seals Jones and he's not out there, and maybe Akins hasn't really shown as much. Probably Bellinger probably lost even more of his rep size over the course of preseason potentially because hey, you're a young player, we drafted you, we like you, but we had to figure out these other guys, right? Then it was about Andre Miller, and then he goes down. That's Austin Allen, and then they have the fullback slash tight, and they end up ultimately releasing. So I think it shifts so much more because without the veterans locked in there, you have even bigger question marks. So yeah, I'm curious, and I guess he is a rookie. It's same thing like Wan'Dale Robinson, right? Like haven't seen as much as we might want to. When Bellinger's been out there, he's looked good, minus the old Evan Ingram that he pulled in last preseason game. But other than that, I think it's fine. I think we'll learn the most about him in the regular season when Kadarius Toney is out there, when you're at full strength, and then he's the byproduct of what the offense is trying to do. So that'll certainly be something to keep an eye on. Offensive line wise, Thomas Lemieux, Feliciano, Glowinski, Neal, those are easy. Zudu's going to make it, obviously, dealing with the injuries. But then, Ben Bredesen, Hamilton, and Douglas. You got Garcia, Holden, and Eric Smith all out. Do you think that, and they say they debated Garcia over Douglas potentially. Like, it's interesting that some of these guys are players that are brought in here to fill the gap because you had the injuries. But we just came out of a preseason game where the expectations were incredibly low and the offensive line did a pretty solid job. So I wonder if like the stopgaps that the Giants brought in are actually maybe creating more competition than they anticipate.
Yeah, I understand that point. This is where I think it's probably makes more sense to go with 6 wide receivers and bring in extra offensive linemen, make that offensive line go from 9 to 10,
Yeah.
just because Shane Lemieux has showed that he has an ability to stay healthy over the last year and a half, 2 years. Feliciano has had dehydration and all these other issues. We don't necessarily know what we're going to get from him. And Ben Bredesen just got carted, basically walked off the field by trainers. So for me, it feels like with all of the injury concerns and injury potential of this offensive group, I probably would want an extra body. Now, am I going to squabble between Jamil Douglas and Max Garcia?
Right.
No, I think maybe even the final preseason game, depending on who's out there. You talked about Holden, you talked about Garcia. If they end up showing to be competent one more time and we get a larger sample size, maybe one of them sneaks on the roster as the 10th man of this offensive line. But again, as you mentioned, going from 80 to 53-man rosters, there's going to be competent linemen getting cut elsewhere.
Defensive line, Ryan Anderson getting in there, starting to show more here in the preseason. Gotta like that. Davidson's going to make it. Nothing really there, 5. Here's where I think we go back to talking about how many wide receivers, because when we get into the edge linebacker room where they're carrying 10, however, Thibodeau, Ojulari, Quincy Roche now gets elevated probably because of that injury to Darian Beavers, just from a number standpoint. Ellerson Smith, Blake Martinez, Ward, Tay Crowder. Now Cam Brown, McFadden, and Ocean Ximenez rounded out. This is where, like, I wonder, you're carrying 10 and Cam Brown because of the special teams value, I think gets in here. Is there anyone, like if we're talking about keeping an extra roster spot open, is there anybody out of this group you go, maybe you bail on him? Like is Quincy Roche, who hasn't to this point shown it the way he did last year for the Giants? Would you jettison him knowing that you're already thin inside of this group, but maybe you need to spend it somewhere else and maybe on the market?
Yeah. So right now, out of the 10 linebackers, the Giants are keeping 6 outside linebackers slash edge rushers, which I find fascinating. It means
Right, so when you need to get inevitably another inside linebacker, something's got to happen.
right, exactly. And I think you're really looking at one roster spot between Quincy Roche and Oshane Ximenez. It's depending on who do you think has more potential, who can help you immediately, who fits Wink Martindale's scheme better. I think, Quincy Roche is probably the guy I would lean on keeping. Where, O'Shea Jimenez had a bad holding penalty, has not really put good film out there, has just not looked great overall. He feels like he's kind of tumbling down the depth chart. So in the linebacking room, I probably think we're going to end up with another middle linebacker, and O'Shea is going to be looking for a roster elsewhere.
You know what I'd love to see too? It's like, and we talk about this, how much value these guys have, but hey, man, look at other teams, injuries otherwise, need a wide receiver. Like, hey, I got a Darius Slayton and an O'Shea Jimenez, and I just need a stable, inside linebacker, a guy that's been mostly a depth piece. We're not talking about starters. Like, let's live in the real world here, right? But if you can pivot a combined $5 million and turn it into one real position of need and value, then I think that's something that hopefully the Giants can maybe explore, depending on how far down the road you can get there with this. If you go to the season starting with a 53-man roster that includes one of these two guys, then it keeps those options open a little bit. I'm surprised. I'm surprised just this. I'm surprised, not surprised, because we ultimately think there has to be a world where the Giants are going to add to this secondary, even though I like youth and I want to stick with that. Jackson Robinson, Holmes, Flott, Rodarius Williams, and then Darren Evans, who again, he's taken his lumps, but I think he's looked, if we're just talking about watching preseason games, he's looked as competent as anybody else in that secondary after Adoree Jackson, who we didn't even touch back on the game, by the way, which we're going to do. He looks fantastic in the preseason so far. He looks every bit of the number one, only carrying 6 there. And then you throw in at the safety spot, they're keeping it tight with McKinney, Love, Belton, and Andrew Adams. So you lose Thompson there, you lose Corker there. That's an interesting one too, to me. And I think they go on to say, depending on what happens here as far as Belton, Yusuf Corker would be their replacement projection for him. And I'll add in the footnote, Corker was doing some return work as well, and maybe that's how you massage that need if you're getting away from CJ Board. But that group all together, 10 total in the secondary, what do you like, not like?
Yeah, it feels like there's maybe one and a half roster spots that are kind of up for debate. Darren Evans being the last cornerback in. Zion Gilbert was out there for a bit. The Giants are probably going to look at different veterans that are going to be cut, as we mentioned before, considering that room is so young. When you look at the names in there, like Darnay Holmes on his rookie contract, Aaron Robinson, second year, Cordell Flott rookie, Rodarius Williams, limited snaps after getting hurt. Adoree Jackson's the only one that has multiple, a few years worth of tape out there. The Giants will absolutely be looking to maybe, bring in a veteran in that piece. And then, in the secondary, in the safety position, it's tough. It all depends on what happens with Dane Belton. Is his collarbone healing? Is he ready to get back out there by week 1 or week 2? Or are they saying, let's not push him. Let's put him on the PUP list. We like what we see from Yusuf Corker, and let's keep him around for a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, listen, so there are some little things that are going to happen here. I'm going to look back at the depth chart. We come back in tomorrow and just kind of talk about, hey, you know what? If it was up to me, and the secondary is a big part of this. Listen, if Darren Evans is showing enough, and I mean showing enough that if you had to put him out there for 10% of the reps on a week-to-week basis on average, if he's showing enough for that, then go with him. He's a rookie. You brought him in. Just go with it and develop that player to find out if maybe going into next season, when things start to open up and you have the money to go spend in the market, let's get some confirmation here. I've said this before. I hate the idea of wasting reps on veterans this year that you almost know for a fact won't be a part of this team going forward. And Andy will push back, rightfully so, and say, but you got to have a team and you got to be competitive. And what will it cost you if you go too much youth, if you lean too far on that one side, and then you 5-6 weeks in go, we might have lost 2 games out of the first 6 because of our youth and inexperience. It's a weird balancing act that this, at least projection, I think, is trying to strike that chord between both sides.
And Adam, at the end of the day, this is the second time that you have just been absolutely disrespectful to our special teams unit. You forgot about Graham Gano, Jamie Gillen, and Casey Kreider. You forgot about the 3 guys that are key to our special teams. It's like you don't even remember that there's 3 different phases to a football game.
Is there really, though?
I mean, look at see the
modern NFL, baby.
The lack of disrespect to this special teams room. Listen, Gano, Kreider, Gillen, I see you. Friend of the show for me. I don't know. It sounds like Adam has some issues he needs to work out with each of you. But at the end of the day, they are human beings and they are football players too, Adam.
Hey, listen, why don't you try to give me a follow back, you sons of guns? Maybe we'll talk. You want to be a special teamer, you Scottish Hammer? follow yours truly. And then we'll get on the podcast, for crying out loud. Let's talk about that hammer you got down there. That
speaking
was
of follows,
not the way that you wanted to phrase that. But speaking of follows, Andy, as you said, you follow us over on YouTube, man. You get us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast. We're breaking this thing down on a mostly daily basis. It'll start to ramp up as we get towards the regular season. You get after us on social media at One Giant Podcast, at Adam Armbrecht. What is it? At AMAC
214.
214, baby, just like we always knew it. Get after us, man. Get the podcast fever, get those needs fulfilled, because we are just completely on pins and needles about the season getting underway and finding out what we have. And here's what they call a little bit of a tease in the business. Andy Makowitz is going to go up and in on the next episode against one Colin Cowherd, who seems to be trying to turn over a new leaf as the preseason winds down. Is he trying to bandwagon us? Stay tuned for the next episode when Andy goes to task. Until next time, though, as Andy would want, need, nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.